So let's see some code then to get started with scope. What is scope about? In JavaScript, we can of course define a variable with the var keyword, for example, my age 31. And of course, you might know that nowadays in modern JavaScript, we also have two other ways of defining a variable or a constant, and that would be let for a variable and const. Now, these are other ways, but let's start with var. After this module, you hopefully will also know why we do have let and const, and especially why we have let if we already had var. But let's start with old school JavaScript here, with var, which you still will see in a lot of scripts out there. This declares and defines a variable. And these are two important terms which I want you to understand and to memorize. Declaring and defining a variable are two different things. This here is the declaration of a variable. In the end, it means we're telling JavaScript, hey, here is a new variable. It doesn't have a value yet, but it's there. When we assign a value to a variable like this, then we define this variable. So when we do this for the first time, we initialize the variable with that value, and that means we define the variable. So declaration is just when we mention it with the var keyword. Definition is when we assign a value to it then. Thereafter, if we assign a new value, we would typically not call this definition. Instead, here we just call this value assignment because we're just assigning a new value to an already declared and defined variable. So these are two important terms, not directly related to scope, but generally important to keep in mind and to know. This is there for a variable, and of course, unsurprisingly, we can now output the myAge variable below that line like this. So if we now go back to the browser and reload this page, we see 31 being printed here, and that's of course coming from this line. Now, actually what we did here is we declared and defined a variable in global scope. Why in global scope? How does this qualify as global scope? Well, it's not inside of a function, and if it's not inside of a function, it's global scope. This means that this variable is globally available everywhere in this file, and because it's JavaScript, even in other JavaScript files we import after this file here. So it's in global scope here. That's important. Now let's see an example for local scope. And for this, I'm going to add a function, greet, but you can choose any name you want, where I want to print hello, and then my name, and therefore I'll add a variable, my name here, and my name is of course Max, so I'll concatenate this here in this string. And with that, we have this function with a variable inside of it. This variable here is declared and defined in local scope, in function scope, therefore. Now, if we call greet down there after logging the age, you will see that if we save this and we reload, this all works just fine and we print hello Max. So Max is getting inserted here. And this is something you probably anticipated, because why would it not work? We have a variable here, then we use it, then we call the function thereafter. Of course this should work. This is just the introduction though. This is just to get you used to those terms, global scope and local scope. Now let's see what we can access where.